At last, we've finished all of the tests for this final episode of Button2Pixel about the Mega Man X Legacy Collection. I know, with the bombshell that was the first episode, it was very easy to write off the whole collection for all the games on all the platforms, but as our second episode showed, the input latency across games varies quite a bit. X1 is the worst, and X8 is the most responsive, but yet again, the scope of that video was very limited. We only tested the collection on the PS4. Now, having spent well over a week doing absolutely nothing but this video, and I mean nothing but this video, we're going to cover it all. We've tested Super Nintendo Entertainment System Classic Edition, I hope you're happy, guy who ragged on me for saying SNES, PS2 X Collection, 3DS Virtual Consoles version of X1, Wii U Virtual Consoles version of X1 on both Gamepad and Pro Controller, and all of the versions of the X Legacy Collection tested on the PlayStation 4 Pro, Xbox One X, PC, and the Switch, both portable and docked on multiple controllers. So please sit back, relax, and let's learn about which platform you should buy the X Legacy Collection on if you intend to buy it, what controllers to use, if the Switch is better docked or portable for input lag, and honestly, by the end of this video, I think you'll be really surprised. So let's get started. Wait, I think that's the thing John Linneman says at the beginning of DF Retro. Let me check.
Every iteration of the game is covered, so let's get started.
Yeah, okay, I'm not gonna steal his thing. I gotta do my own thing. Gotta be an individual, or how else am I gonna ascend to the influencer status? This input lag's getting crazy. Let's rock! First things first, here's a guide to understanding our methodology here. We film us pushing a button at 1200 frames per second, count the frames until the action is shown on screen, we convert those frames into milliseconds, and then subtract our TV's input lag from it. We do this 20 times per game, and then we average out the input latency to get our results. As we've discussed in prior videos, Mega Man X1 has some serious input lag on the X Legacy Collection. Now, we've tested even more versions of X1 so we can provide a broader context for how this fares against the larger collective of official emulation on the SNES Classic Edition and Virtual Console. Take a look at this first chart, which is comprised of versions of X1 that were released prior to the X Legacy Collection. As you can see, the most latent version is the Wii U being played with the Pro Controller, followed closely by the PS2 collection. The Wii U Pro Controller being more laggy than the gamepad is something I had heard about from Bob before, but I'm surprised to see this reflected in our very first test on the platform. That seems a little backwards, doesn't it? You would think a Pro Controller would be carefully optimized for greater ergonomics and input latency. I digress though. The 3DS Virtual Console version is more latent than the Wii U, but that's because it, unlike the rest of our tests, has to include the display's input latency. It is a portable after all, and that's the screen that everyone plays those games on. It's an inextricable element of the platform. Even still, the lower input lag there fights through the 3DS's inferior display to still get a respectable input lag score compared to the X Legacy Collection. I was also pleasantly surprised with how the SNES Classic Edition fared here. It's only about 21 milliseconds more latency than the SNES original. But enough of these respectively responsive versions, let's pull up the X Legacy Collection. Ah, there we go. Now, I'm gonna show a graph of all the games we tested at the end. For now, I'm showing this graph because I don't want the details of the X Legacy Collection on all these platforms to get lost in the fray. So, obviously these versions are a lot more latent. The graph is literally to the same scale as the last one, but weirdly enough, all versions are roughly in the same ballpark of latency. The PS4 Pro and the Xbox One X versions are basically identical and tied for last place. The PC comes in second place, and the Switch version is the most responsive by nearly a whole frame. But there are a lot of tests on the Switch, and I figure I should clarify what's going on. So let's switch to another graph of just the Switch tests. So let me explain what the USB in parentheses means. On the Switch, even if you plug your Pro Controller in via the USB cable, it is still sending your inputs via wireless. The reason is twofold. Firstly, they don't want the controller to need to do a handshake with the console every time you disconnect it, and with the way the consoles are set up, the input latency of wireless is actually better than a wired connection. You can see this in our tests up there. When we activated a mode that forced the Pro Controller to transmit data via the USB, it actually added about 13 milliseconds of input lag. That's almost a whole frame more, which you can see easily because each vertical line in the graph represents a whole frame of input lag. That seems backwards though, right? Why would a wired connection have more latency than a wireless connection? Well, it's probably that the Switch isn't polling the USB devices at a high enough frequency and the Bluetooth's responsiveness wins out over the slow polling rate. I'm guessing it polls slower than once every 4 milliseconds, probably once every 8 milliseconds, but I don't know. I don't have information on this. This is all conjecture. So then, what is this dongle all about? The dongle in the chart is referring to our 8-bit DOE wireless receiver for the Switch. It's a $20 dongle that you can put into the USB port, and it allows you to use a DualShock 4 with your Switch. The problem is that it's adding wireless input lag on top of the aforementioned really bad USB input lag, which results in 23 more milliseconds than just using a Pro controller. That's really disappointing. 1.5 frames of input lag is actually pretty substantial. I was hoping to use this thing to play Splatoon 2 with my DualShock 4, but it's definitely gonna feel substantially worse than a Pro controller. So the last two tests at the bottom are the portable mode, and just like with the 3DS, they include the screen's input lag. What does that tell us? Well, two things. The first being that the Joy-Con is maybe not the best for input latency. We'll prove this for sure in a future video with much more testing. Secondly, it tells us that the Switch's screen has really good input lag. It barely has any more latency than the Pro controller tests on our results with the display lag subtracted from them. So if you have a TV with really bad input lag, then switching to portable mode could really help you out if the game's performance is about the same. Obviously, if a game runs at a much lower frame rate, that's going to affect input lag, but in a game that performs well in both modes, it could make sense to play portably. Personally, I prefer my OLED's near instantaneous pixel response time to the lower input lag. Here, just watch slow-mo footage of the Switch screen. See how long it takes to change those pixels? Now look at our LG B7 OLED. The frame changes instantly on the OLED, and the LCD, as I mentioned before, takes a while to transition, but I digress. That's a topic for another video. To wrap up the never-ending Mega Man X1 part of this video, here's all of the tests thrown together on one graph. You can still see there is a massive difference between the older collections and ports and the X Legacy collection. I mean, hell, the SNES Classic Edition has about half as much latency as the X Legacy collection. But yeah, that's enough X1. The rest of this video will go much faster from here because there aren't that many versions of these other games. So X4 is more responsive than X1 on every platform, but look at the Xbox One X results. It's almost as good as the original game. The PC version actually did better than the original game, but that's with no VSync enabled, so it featured a heavy amount of screen tearing. The Switch is almost a whole frame of lag more responsive than the PS4, which comes in dead last by a fucking mile. This is really strange because if it was hardware limited, I would expect the PS4 Pro to perform better than the Switch, but here it is, in last place. The Xbox One X is just about 2 entire frames more responsive at approximately 32 milliseconds less input lag. This is ridiculously better. Let's see if this spread continues into the other games. Moving on to X7, and yes, I can hear you closing this tab already, things are getting even crazier. The PS4 is still markedly more latent than any other version, the Switch has barely any extra latency at all compared to the original game, the Xbox One actually has less input lag, and the PC without VSync has 20 milliseconds less input lag, making it 25% more responsive than the PS2 original version. That is incredible. If it weren't for the gosh darn screen tearing, this would be far and away the version I'd recommend. Okay, let's go on to X8. By this point, I was getting really curious if the Xbox One X was only doing so well because of its enormous horsepower, even though that goes against what we noted about the PS4 Pro earlier. So we added an Xbox One launch model into the testing and somehow it did better than the Xbox One X? It's really strange. More importantly than that, which could just be the margin of error, the Switch and PS4 are both at about 1.5 frames more input lag than the original, with the Switch still taking the lead. The PC, on the other hand, was just plain ridiculous at this point. It has half as much input lag as the original game with VSync disabled, so that's when I got thinking, what if we could use G-Sync to make it not have screen tearing, but still be really responsive? And as you can see here, we did exactly that. So we made this comparison, including the display latency from our LG B7 OLED TV, which is about 25 milliseconds, and the Dell S2716DG G-Sync monitor, and it's amazing to think you can get 46 milliseconds of input lag out of this game with no screen tearing whatsoever on a G-Sync monitor via PC. G-Sync and variable refresh rate tech is really great and something I look forward to becoming even more standard on next-gen consoles. If we go back to that previous chart though, you'll see at the bottom we did versions using a DualShock 4 via input mapper, and another version using a DualShock 4 with VSync enabled, and as you can see, the input lag got so bad at that point that any other version of the game was better, though PS4 was only slightly better, which is amazing. So obviously, if you want to use a controller and have no screen tearing while enjoying a responsive experience, the Xbox One is the platform of choice for the X Legacy Collection. I think it's pretty incredible. I really didn't expect this, because as I noted a second ago, it isn't just the X that is this responsive, it's the Xbox One original as well. This next chart, I've taken Mega Man X1 out of it because its conclusion made it really difficult to see the trend across platforms. You know, X1 is terrible on every single platform. Anyway, as you can see, the Xbox One is much more responsive than the other platforms when it comes to every game aside from X1. X4 adds less than 30% input lag on the original. Everything else is basically identical to the original version. That is, of course, aside from X1, which, as I said 10 seconds ago, is terrible. As you might notice, we did test X Challenge on both the PS4 Pro and Xbox One X, and the PS4 continues being incredibly laggy when it comes to input latency compared to the Xbox One. I mean, that's almost 2 whole frames of latency again on the PS4, as compared to the Xbox One X. I'm very curious if this is something we'll see in other games when we test them. It's also interesting that the Switch is more responsive than the PS4 Pro in every game we tested, despite being much, much less powerful. And now I'll end this video on this chart because someone out there wants to see all this info on one graph, I'm sure. If you enjoyed this video and found it insightful, then please subscribe and consider supporting us on Patreon. At very least, hit the thumbs up right there. Making a video this scale caused us to accidentally shut down the rest of the channel and spend all of our free time working on it for 9 days straight. So if you like us looking into this sort of thing, your support is strongly needed. It's not easy making these. In the upcoming Button2Pixel videos, we'll be looking into spiritual successors, Sega's Genesis collections, controller options for modern consoles and PCs, and input latency in the action game genre. It will be a little while though before we can do another one because, well, we have to work on other videos for this channel, and oh yeah, I have a day job and supposedly a life outside of this channel, but all I can recall doing for the last week is counting frames, so I'm really starting to doubt that.
This video burst into existence via the extra-dimensional powers of our executive producer God Kings. Vincent Poverk, Cywolf, Nicholas Cameron, E. Lee Broyles, Joshua Mattingly, Brendan O'Sullivan, Trouncing Trogdor, Starfalcon, Spaceman Spiff, Shadow in the Darkness, Malezra, Danny Richardson, Luigi 1000, Dryzart, and Wardonis. Thanks, God Kings.
And also thanks to these guys.
Head on over to patreon.com/GigaBoots today to become one of these names.